Hello and welcome to Downs Your Way. I'm Colin Speller, and today's guest in the Back to the Start series is Aidan Goldstraw. Aidan.
Hello,
Hello.
Colin. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. And this is a first for Downs Your Way because we are doing this by Zoom. We are socially and physically distanced. We're sitting here both looking like the sort of virtual version of Smashy and Nicey in our respective, I inverted commas in the air, studios. I should take a screenshot, Aidan, of the, as you were just saying just now, the lockdown haircut brackets lack of.
Yes, absolutely. As I was telling Colin just before we came on air, we had our two Westies clipped a couple of weeks ago, and I was very tempted to get into the van with them.
Yes, I won't accuse you of looking like Boris Johnson. That would be too deep an insult. But hair-wise, at least, there is some resemblance. Anyway, Aidan, welcome to the podcast. And as I was saying to you earlier, the basis of these is to sort of go through how you got into music and how you got into working with Rebecca. But let's go right back to the beginning. Where and when did life start for Aidan?
Well, I was born in Burslem in the Potteries, but in fact our family never actually lived there. We lived on the outskirts of the Potteries at the time, and my dad was a sales rep, so we moved all around the country really during my childhood. We lived in York for a while, and then we lived in Scotland for quite a few years until we moved back down to Staffordshire when I was about 8 years old.
And how did you get into music?
I'm not sure. I think it's always been an innate part of me. My mum was a very good pianist, and she had a grand piano. And while she was practicing, I used to play when I was a toddler beneath the grand piano as a sort of a den, I guess. And I started singing the things that she was playing. I'm told that I used to sing bits of Bach while I was being pushed along the street in my pushchair. And then one day, probably when I was just about nudging 5 years old, I climbed on the piano stool and demanded lessons, and basically I've been there ever since.
And did you do a sort of formal musical education in the sense of doing your grade exams and that sort of thing?
Yes, although that actually didn't come until a little bit later. My first two teachers weren't the sort who believed in exams very much, although I learnt the normal classical repertoire. But I only really started doing the grade exams when when we moved back down here really, and I had my next teacher, and that's when I started doing the exams. But I was always one of those peculiar children, very rare peculiar children, who had to be told that that's enough practice for now, rather than have you done your practice?
Yeah, I've mentioned this on here before. I actually started down the same road and got to about grade 3, and I think lost interest because I was very much one of those children who had to be told to do their practice. So I think that probably is the natural separation of those who really have got it and those that haven't. I suspect, around that whole issue of whether you want to be doing it or not.
I think it's one of those things that you sort of have in your genes. I really do believe that. I think musicians, they've always got music running through their head, whether they're doing that or whether they're doing something else. I can be sitting at the TV watching something, and my fingers will be moving on the arms of the armchair, and my wife will say to me, "What's that one now then?" And I'll look down and say, "No idea." It's sort of like a musician's Tourette's. And but I think as I was saying, it's something totally genetic. My brother Lyndon was totally tone deaf by comparison,
Really?
and my dad wasn't really musical either. So and I think he also skips sometimes, and one of Lyndon's children is quite musical, and one of my great nephews, great niece is musical as well. But it really does tend to skip, I think.
I know I'd surely go back there, 'cause I'm no good.
Having that sort of fairly classical education, when did you start performing music?
Yeah, interesting. I suppose I was always being sort of dragged out to play the sort of party pieces, mini Mozart type thing from my mother's mother and father's friends. I remember being bought an organ, one of these home organs, when I was, I think, about 11. And within about 2 months of having that, I was roped in to play for a New Year's Eve party at some local hockey club. And the guy who was organising it, who was a local grocer, actually had to collect this huge cabinet home organ and put it on the back of his lorry, so that he could take me to the hockey club to play for New Year's Eve. And I made enough to buy an electric guitar.
Excellent. I was going to go on to say, do you play other instruments, or did you learn other instruments as a child?
Mostly guitar. I have to say that my guitar playing is entirely rudimentary, and I don't think I've picked one up for probably about a dozen years now. I tried a few wind instruments, flute and French horn, but wind instruments didn't seem to be my thing. In retrospect, I think I would have preferred to probably attempt another string instrument, maybe the violin or cello. The trouble with both of those, as you're probably aware, is that it's a long time before you sound even bearable, let alone good.
Tell me about it. I went to a very musical school, and I can remember, I shudder at the thought of the sort of, 11, 12, 13-year-old violinists caterwauling their way through something as at the start of morning assembly. It was horrific at times, to be honest. I mean, a lot of them went on to be very, very good players indeed, but we all suffered those early attempts. The impression I'm getting is you're going down a fairly sort of classical road, in inverted commas again. When did you get into more contemporary music? Was that right from the off, or did you get into it later on?
I've always had a tremendously Catholic with a small c attitude to music, and I've always been a voracious consumer of music of all types. So, I was listening to pop when I was a kid. I was bothering people to buy me records. I'm now going to give my age away a little bit here by saying that there were things like the Tremolos and the Hollies. But actually, those were bought for me when I was really quite young. And if you compared my record collections with some of my contemporaries a bit later on, my collection went way, my knowledge of music went much further back than that. So I think I've always been this sponge, really, just sucking up everything and anything I could. I've always liked music of all sorts, and I can admire and get something from anything that is done well. The exception used to be country and western, which I couldn't stand, but more recently I've become a little bit more tolerant.
Yes, I love that line from the Blues Brothers where they go to that bar and he says, "What sort of music do you have here?" And she says, "We have both types, country and western."
Yeah, great movie.
When did you get into playing for what we might describe in modern terms as a band of the type that like Rebecca's type, sort of modern beat combo, as it were?
Yeah, well, my music teacher, my piano teacher, who I had when I came back down to Staffordshire, a guy called Alan Hayes, who I'm still very good friends with, he exposed me to a lot of prog rock. He was totally into that, and because of the way that prog rock sometimes bridges that gap between classical and rock music, it was a very natural way to do it. And so he would play me something like Emerson, Lake and Palmer, and then he would play me the original Bartok or whatever they'd taken the thing from. So I started sort of getting into the rockier end of things there. I suppose my first band was a school one. Inevitably, we had a great teacher called Steve Mee, who was the RE teacher, but he was your typical 1970s trendy school teacher with the suede jackets and the leather patches and the long hair and everything. but he played guitar, and we put together this band which we absolutely horrified most of the school with, but they thought it was great, and we thought it was great at the time. But I didn't really start playing in bands until I went to university. I was at the University of East Anglia in Norwich, and I started playing in a few bands there, mostly rather up ourselves jazz funk type bands. We liked, Weather Report and Pat Metheny and things like that. We thought were great. Actually, I still do think those things are great, but we sort of worshipped them rather than appreciated them, I think, at the time. And our efforts to replicate what we were hearing were by no means close to anything remarkable.
So where did it go from there? So university bands to what?
Well, it went to a rather barren period. I would say I studied music there, obviously, and it was always thought that I would pursue a career in music. But I actually majored in composition while I was at university, and I got out of university to find that there wasn't much call for composers. Surprise, surprise. And I floated around trying to get a job at various places. This was during the Thatcher years, so unemployment was pretty rife, and most people, I guess, got out of university and probably spent about a year or so out of work, as I did. And eventually I saw an advert in the local newspaper looking for cub reporters, for trainee reporters. And I'd always enjoyed writing as well, so my fiancée at the time said, who became my first wife, why don't you try for that? So I did, and then got one of the two posts. And that was how I fell into journalism for about 3 decades. And during that time, for various reasons, I won't really go into here, but I didn't do much music at all.
Mm.
And, there wasn't sort of time for, playing out, the thought of playing out professionally, really. So it all went on hold for probably about, as I say, probably the best part of 20 years. And then came 2005, I believe it was. And that was the year of what I called the 3 big scary things. The first of which was that I got divorced. My first wife and I just were drifting apart, really, and one of those things, you marry young and your lives tend to go in different directions. We're still very good friends, I have to say, so there's no acrimony about it. But I also met back up with Vicky, who I'd known since primary school. We used to walk down to school together in the village where we lived in Staffordshire. We were never boyfriend and girlfriend, just mates, and something just clicked, and that was it. We made plans to get married, and probably about 2 months before the wedding, we'd been out for a drive in the country with a friend, and for once Vicky was sitting behind me in the car rather than next to me, and she came out of the car and said, "How long have you had that lump behind your ear?" So enter the second big scary thing. It turned out I'd got salivary gland cancer.
Good Lord.
And after much poking about and being referred to specialists here, there and everywhere, who kept saying, "Oh, I'm sure it's benign," they eventually took the tumour out and said, actually, no, it wasn't benign. And I had to have radiotherapy and various things. So that was the second big scary thing. I'm glad to say I've been free of that for many, many years now, and they don't want to see me again. So I'm presuming all is well.
Excellent.
And then the third big scary thing was that we had a new editor come and work on the paper where I was, by that time I was heading up the newspaper's internet operations. We'd started the website as a sort of a 2-man operation and built it up into a whole department. And we had a change of editor, and the guy was, frankly, an absolute psychopath who hated me and hated most people. And then they suddenly had a round of redundancies being offered. And I turned to Vicky and said, you know what, I'm out of here. I don't want to do something else. So I went in and told him that I was resigning and I was going to go freelance and I was going to be a professional musician as well. By that time, I'd started doing a few solo piano gigs, mostly for weddings. I put a little website up, and I remember the first booking that came in was probably about 4 days after I put the website up, and it was a guy from American Express Gold Card Concierge Service, and he said, I have a stockbroker near Manchester who wants a pianist for their Christmas party. This was December, as you might guess. Mm-hmm. And can you go and do it? I said, yes, that's fine. And I said, do I need to take a piano with me? He said, no, he's got a grand piano. I thought, okay. So I rolled up at this place. It was a place called Mere, just sort of just near the A56. And this guy was the very weirdest stockbroker I ever come across. He was like the Hugh Fernley Whittingstall of stockbrokers, I think. And he showed me to this lovely grand piano. I said, "Oh, do you play yourself?" He said, "No, I bought it with the intention of thinking I might learn to play, but never did." I thought, "Okay, that's nice for you." And I sat down at this Joanna, beautiful, beautiful instrument. I went up and down the keyboard and I looked at him and said, "How long is it since you had it tuned?" And he said, "Oh, do they need tuning?" So I played for his Christmas dinner party. There was only about 8 people there. And this beautiful instrument, but it sounded like Chaz and Dave all night. No matter what I played, it sounded like Chaz and Dave. And it didn't really matter because by about an hour in, they were all so absolutely off their heads on the alcohol that it didn't really matter. And as I was preparing to leave, this woman came up to me and said, "Thank you so much for your playing. It's not everybody who can play and sing at the same time like that." I said, "Oh, thank you." I said, "Actually, I wasn't singing tonight. I was just playing." I'm thinking, "No, just shut up, Aidan. Take the money. Go." So that was my first gig. And so I did a huge amount of solo piano work at that point. Lots of weddings. And at big venues as well. You know, I've been lucky enough to play at things like the Dorchester, the Savoy, Blenheim Palace, a couple of times at Blenheim Palace. And, you know, so I've probably played at more people's weddings than you've had hot dinners. And then we got to a point, I can't remember, when was the crash? About 2008, was it?
Yeah.
Yeah, that happened, and the number of bookings started to go down steadily. And I thought, well, I've got to do something else here. I don't want to stop playing. And a good friend of mine, Scott Ralph, who's very well known as a songwriter and producer, who I happen to know through the church in Newcastle on the Lyme, where I'm director of music. Scott was a attendee there at the time, and he was in the church band with me. And Scott said, "Well, why don't you do some do some gigs with me?" So we started doing a few pub gigs, and then we're coming to the point where we're getting to the point now where the Goldstraw Downs worlds collide, because at one point I was then recruited into a band which was now called the Chris Bevington Organisation, which was then called Chris Bevington and Friends initially. And it was the early incarnation of that band was rather more rotational. It was whoever was available, really. So the keys, although the keys position now is filled more permanently, at the time it was being rotated between myself and George Glover from Climax Blues Band. And I think I'm right in saying that we first bumped into each other, you, Rebecca, and I, at a gig at the Robin.
Yes, I remember
where we were sort of double heading, I think.
Yes, yeah.
And so I got chatting to Rick Benton, Rebecca's keys player at the time, and as you do, and because keyboard players always like to sort of shoot the breeze and talk about keyboards, because nobody else will talk about keyboards with them. And so we got talking, and we got friendly, and I had a chat with Rebecca as well, and we all got along very well. And then somewhere down the line, I got the call to actually come do some gigs with you guys.
Massive amount to sort of unpack in that story. Your career as a journalist, I mean, that would be worth several podcasts on its own, I'm sure, as I know from a little bit of personal experience, but also a very good friend who cut his teeth as a journalist on local newspapers, again through that sort of difficult period of change and consolidation, and which almost certainly led to the changes that you made. It's a very interesting world, isn't it? In featured particularly in that Ricky Gervais Afterlife series most recently. I don't know whether you've seen that, but that's centred on a character who works for a local paper.
No, I haven't. I must check that out. Regional journalism is one of those things which the face of it has changed totally over the last few years, to the point that really it almost doesn't exist, which is really a big shame. When my first big paper was the Express and Star in Wolverhampton, and I went there initially as a sub-editor, which those are the people, for people who don't know, those sub-editors are people who read through the copy, correct it, rewrite it, trim it for length, design the page layouts, write the headlines, things like that. You're totally involved in the production side. And when I joined the Express and Star, I think we were doing with the Shropshire Star, we were doing a combined daily circulation of close to 250,000.
Blimey.
250,000, and we were doing, I think, I'm right in saying, 12 editions a day of the Express and Star. So it taught me to be very quick because you had deadlines constantly coming up on pages throughout the day. It was just totally relentless. So you either sank or swam with it. But it taught me to be very quick. And when I moved into going freelance, and after I resigned from the paper in 2005, I did a few freelance shifts at places like the Sentinel in Stoke, and they were always amazed at just how quick I was. In fact, somebody gave me the name the Copy Hoover, because you could. There's somebody say, "Oh, I've got this page here, so I'll give it to the Copy Hoover." But that's you just learn to be quick and accurate, and that's the skill you learn. So I can turn copy around very, very quickly, and it's still one of those skills I still have. But the commitment to covering the local scene now in newspapers is paper thin. It's almost not there anymore, and I fear that really probably another decade we may see most of these newspapers close altogether, because I don't see how they can survive really.
No, it's sad in many ways, but I suppose it's an inevitable byproduct of the growth of the internet, really, isn't it? And the availability of information, and also the sort of cost base. I mean, I lived in some wild and woolly places where the local newspaper, back in the day was everything. My favourite local newspaper was the Rutland and Stamford Mercury, which claimed to be Britain's oldest newspaper, and its stock in trade was to find a local angle for almost anything. And one of its best ever headlines, there was a major national news story of a murder case in Luton, and it carried the headline one week which said, "Murdered Luton woman lived next door to ex-Stamford man."
Yes, the relentless search for the local angle.
Relentless search for the local angle. And my other favourite story from local news is from my friend who worked in a couple of papers, one in Derbyshire and one in Northamptonshire. He worked for an editor whose favourite line was, "Oh, that's far too good to check." You better run with that, lad. That's far too good to check. So, are you still involved in journalism today?
Yes, on a rather different level. What I've been doing for the last 15 years really has been largely focused on specialized trade magazines, the sort of thing that you see at the end of Have I Got News for You, basically. Although I haven't got as low as Roundabout News or anything like that yet. I spent probably the best part of, well, more than a decade editing a magazine called Promotional Product Distributor. Try saying that with your teeth in. And that was aimed at the promotional industry, the people who put logos on things and stress relievers and pencils and everything you can brand, basically.
Band merchandise.
Yeah, band merchandise. Yeah, absolutely. And then from that I actually got a referral to do another magazine which I'm still involved with, which is Openings. And Openings is the trade journal of the British Blinds and Shutters Association. Again, another one.
I'm glad you added that qualification after opening with that title, if you'll pardon.
Yes. So I've been doing that for must be on about the sixth or seventh year of doing that one, and that's the one I still do. I do a bit of PR for people, writing copy for them and stuff like that. I do a few websites because the internet. He was talking about the internet being the downfall of local journalism. Well, I would have to put my hand up to being complicit in that in a way, because I was an early adopter of the internet in the days where you paid somebody called Demon Internet £10 a month, and they would give you this DOS program, which you would dial up with, and it would go, and it would download your email, and then you would disconnect. You would read your email, you would write all your replies, and then you would connect up again and upload it all. Yeah. And you could fire up, I remember, a program called Mosaic, which was the first web browser, and there were about 10 websites, and they were all got this dull grey background, and they were all sort of very heavily academic. So you didn't bother after you'd had a look at it once. And so this was sort of known at work, I guess, and somebody said, oh, he knows something about the internet, when they were saying, well, we should do a website. So I was confined into this office, but we built up, from the ground upwards. We built expressandstar.com as it became, from ground zero up to around about 7 million page views a month, something like that. And that was really the time when it was a classic case of newspapers missing the boat because of their fetish about print, really. Mm-hmm. Had they seen the way things were going, they could have easily cornered the market at that point in such things as homes, cars and stuff like that, which they already had the market in anyway. And they didn't. Largely because we had, we had a managing director who memorably once said to me, "Oh, the internet it's like CB radio; it'll all be over in 6 months." Yeah, I don't think he's on the speaking circuit anymore. But that was what you came up against. You came up against people who had always been on the print side and felt very territorial, and so they wanted to minimize your impact. But what they were actually doing was writing their own death notice, really.
Yeah, it's very sad.
I don't think so.
So what are you doing musically these days, apart from appearing with Rebecca?
Yeah, well, when lockdown isn't happening.
Yes, sorry, I should have said in normal circumstances. What would you do?
I'm still playing the occasional gig with Scott Ralph, because he's balmy and so am I, and we kind of like each other's sort of way of doing things. Gigs with Scott are very unpredictable. He'll just announce something. He might give you the key if you're lucky, and away you go. But the main focus of my musical activity in the past year or so has been the formation of a band called Both Sides Now, and we play the music of Joni Mitchell. I've been a huge fan of Joni Mitchell ever since I was at university, really. That really was the soundtrack to my university years. And I've always had this idea that I really wanted to form a band, not quite a tribute band, because we don't sort of try to totally ape the arrangements and note for note and things like that. But it's one of those things I've always really wanted to do. And then about 4 years earlier, I went into a pub and somebody was playing a jazz set there, and they had a singer at the front called Sarah Miller. Sarah I had been aware of for some time as sort of friends of friends, but we never actually never actually met. And I took her to a dark corner of the pub and propositioned her, really, as Sarah will tell you, and said, I don't know if you fancy this, but I've always wanted to do a Joni Mitchell tribute. And she said, yes, so have I. And that was the seed of that idea. And it took a while for us to bring it to fruition. I think it's one of those things we talked about for about a year. And then we did a couple of gigs as a duo, and then realized that if we really wanted to take it to the next level, we were going to have to recruit a band. And that's when you start looking quite hard and long at who you can recruit, because if you think of the caliber of musicians that Joni Mitchell had working with her, you have to have some incredibly good musicians to even get close to what they were doing. If you think of just the bass player's position, for example, you've got to have Jaco Pastorius. So it took us a while to recruit the right people, but we were lucky enough to get some really good players, to the point where, I am the total duffer in the band, really. People start up playing and I'm sort of, oh really, you can do that? So we've been touring that show around regional theatres for about a year and a bit, and we're due to really push in with our 2020 plans when all the wheels fell off, as I'm sure you're all too familiar with, Colin.
Yeah. Well, it's a very sad situation, but assuming that we do get back to something like normal, you'll be striking ahead with that again, will you?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it's one of those things we've really enjoyed putting it together. Every time we come together and play, we have just such tremendous fun. And as I say, I'm just so in awe of the tremendous musicians we have with us, that it's one of those things that I can't not continue with, really. So we have a gig planned for October, but I doubt, to be honest, whether that's going to go ahead. If I'm realistic, I don't expect us to be back on the road until 2021.
No, I think that's a fair assessment. We were talking to somebody the other day who said that in terms of promoting gigs, his insurer has told him he will not get insurance cover until 2021. So that's quite a salutary statement, really. During the lockdown period, though, you've also been doing some online stuff. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, as I say, felt a bit like going back to my roots, because it's been a while since I've done a few solo piano gigs, really. I have done the odd wedding, but since I started working with Scott and with Chris, and then with Both Sides Now, it's not something I've pursued as aggressively, I suppose, because it's still quite a saturated market, and it can be a stressful thing to work on the wedding circuit, because you have a very demanding brides, shall we say, for one thing. And as I say, it's a very competitive market. So I've done a few things like that, but not a huge amount. So it's been some time since I did some solo piano gigs. So I thought, well, perhaps I could do something along those lines, just to sort of entertain people and brighten up a dull evening. And very fortuitously, I'd at the end of last year, I bought a huge amount of video gear with the idea of making promotional stuff both for myself and for both sides now, etc., and learned how to use it. And so I was very quick to be able to get up a proper live streaming setup here. You can probably see the camera tripod behind me. And every Thursday night, 7:30 on Facebook, I've been doing an hour of tunes, just solo piano tunes, playing everything from this Supertramp to who else? Anybody really? Prince, Alicia Keys, Pink Floyd. They've been getting piano renditions of everything. So those have proven quite popular. But it's sort of like a shared cocktail hour almost. That people will get a glass of wine and and just gather around and put me on the television. So,
excellent. And is that just on Facebook, or do you do it on YouTube as well?
Well, I was doing Sunday nights on YouTube originally. I was doing Thursday nights on Facebook, Sunday night on YouTube. But the YouTube one didn't have that much of a following for some reason. It seemed to divide people, and maybe it wasn't the right time of the day, I don't know, or the right time of the week. So what I have been doing recently, I've done the Thursday night show live on Facebook, and then been uploading the live stream for people to enjoy afterwards onto the YouTube channel.
I'll put a link to your YouTube channel on the notes below the podcast. Aidan, that's been superb. Thank you very much indeed.
No problem.
I'm thoroughly enjoyed that chat, and we look forward to a return to normal times and to seeing you again on stage with Rebecca. Who knows when that will be? I think we both agree you're probably looking for 2021. When in 2021 is a matter probably for a podcast in its own right, but whenever it is, we very much look forward to it. Looking forward to seeing you again soon, and thank you very much indeed for talking to us today.
No problem, Colin. I think we just need to get the crystal ball out, don't we? But it's always a great pleasure to play with you guys, and to meet you again, and to get on stage with you. I always have tremendous fun working with Rebecca, and I look forward to doing so in the future.
Second that very much. Thanks, Aidan. Thank you. Thank you for listening to Downs Your Way. As usual, there is a merchandise discount code for use in our online shop. If you put the word GOLD, all in capitals, GOLD, in at the appropriate point in the checkout process at www.rebeccadowns.com/shop, you will receive a 10% discount on all items purchased. Thank you for listening, and we look forward to being with you again soon.